Razor Pages in Action with Mike Brind.
The Azure DevOps podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast, deliver quality, and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. And this podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software architecture company empowering .NET teams to be self-sufficient and able to deliver world-class results through its ClearMeasure way for effective software teams. Now, quick announcement, my architect forums are going strong, and we're half a year into the first year. Signups for the next session are up for the July sessions. And if you lead a software team, if you're a lead architect and you're looking to collaborate with peer architect leaders, then the architect forums are for you. Go ahead and sign up at the link in the show notes. And also for those of you looking for Programming with Palermo, my video podcast, just go ahead and search in any of the podcast directories or on YouTube. You'll be able to find it easy enough. So my guest today on the show is Mike Brind. He spent the first 20 years of his working life in a series of successful sales and marketing roles, and towards the end of which he was introduced to HTML and databases. He's a dormant inner geek, and that took over, and Mike became very much more interested in developing websites than selling advertising space on them. As well as books such as those in the Rocks Beginner series, Mike became reliant on the enormous amount of free help provided by online communities while he learned his new craft. And he's now one of the all-time leading contributors to the official ASP.NET forums, forums.asp.net. They've been huge over the years, and he was also a moderator there. And as a result of his contributions to the ASP.NET community via the forums and through his technical article site at mikes.netting.com, Mike received the Microsoft Most Valuable Professional Award for ASP.NET from 2008 to 2018. And beginning ASP.NET Web Pages with Matrix is Mike's first book. And his latest book, published in 2022, is ASP.NET Core Razor Pages in Action. Mike, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Very well. Thank you for inviting me, Jeffrey.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure indeed. It's always great to have experts on the show and book authors and people who have been recognized by Microsoft as a most valuable professional in a certain area. So the honor's all mine. Now, I want to ask you about your latest book, but it's really interesting. You are someone who did not go to university for programming. You decided a little bit later, you know what? Yeah, I'd really like to do this whole programming thing. Can you expound on that? And was that easy? Was that natural, or was that a tough road? What were the key points there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I left school not really knowing what I wanted to do, and found myself working for a publishing company selling advertising space in sort of trade magazines that went to people who made furniture and carpet retailers and really niche markets like that. And over the years, the offer from the publishing company sort of grew to include websites. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I think I was always a little bit geeky. And I started getting interested in what made the websites work. And so in my own time, I started to sort of read up on things like HTML and stuff, and found that it worked perfectly well for me. It was kind of a natural language. And so I also was more interested in data than selling to people. So I got interested in databases as well. And then I discovered this sort of magic called VB script, which allowed you to plug databases into web pages. And so I spent probably a couple of years just teaching myself from books and online resources how to put these things together, and just found that I enjoyed it.
A lot to be enjoyed there. I think that there's a lot of people who resonate with that, where something about it just grips you and you start doing it and say, wow, borderline on fun. I mean, it's work, but it's kind of fun too.
It's more fun than work, I've always found.
Yeah.
I sometimes feel a little bit guilty that I enjoy my work too much.
Well, isn't that the biggest trick we can play on life, is to find something that's so enjoyable, but yet other people will pay us a living to do it?
Exactly. I guess, yeah. I mean, sports people have the greatest life. They must
Sure.
do, but second to that must be programming.
There you go. My 13-year-old son, just a week ago, I sat down with him and, him, like so many other boys his age, video game. Well, we programmed a video game in Unity, and I had him type every character, and about halfway through, it flipped, and he was making up new things that we could make this little bouncy ball do in this Unity video game that we were programming in C#. And he was coming up with new requirements. How do we do that? How do we do that? So I'm thinking, let's see. But so he caught the fun.
Excellent. Have you taught him how to use ChatGPT to answer the questions?
Not yet. Not yet. But yeah, that tool's being embedded everywhere. So Photoshop has already embedded the generative technology. I have a coworker who he did a snapshot, but then he wanted a bigger background than he actually took the picture in. And so the Photoshop has hey, you know what? Just generate a bigger canvas, generate a bigger background. And it literally did a great job in guessing, if you backed up the camera and took a wider shot, what it would have looked like. It's amazing.
It is, isn't it? It's stunning, the sort of things that these things can achieve now.
Yeah. Well, we've actually done several shows on generative AI, but I want to ask you more about Razor pages, because you've gone deep in that topic, and you've published a recent book. And so talk about that. What caused you to focus or get sparked on that particular technology? Because the .NET ecosystem is so big. But what sparked your interest and said, you know what, this is really interesting. I want to write a book about this.
So I think you've already mentioned that I started with Classic ASP, which is basically it's a text file with an ASP extension, and you put it on. You write your code in it, and you pop it on the server, and then you type the address, and it magically finds it and generates the content. And that sort of page-based model works very well for me. It's very, very simple to sort of understand and reason about. And it sort of carried across to web forms when the .NET framework was introduced back at the turn of the century. But the web forms sort of lost sight of HTML. And then I think it was around about 2008 or so that the MVC framework came out, which I think you wrote about.
Yeah, I did a few books on that.
Yeah, that started getting you back towards working with HTML and sort of traditional web technologies, but it wasn't a particularly intuitive sort of framework to work with. You had to put your sort of stuff into certain folders with specific names on them in order for the framework to find them, and that you had to learn an awful lot of conventions. So Microsoft, I think it was about 2010, they introduced a framework called Web Pages, which also saw the introduction of the Razor syntax, which is now widely used in ASP.NET core development. And that sort of reverted back to a page-based model where you just create a file, pop it onto the server, and the web server would serve it up. And so I wrote a book about that because it went back to a more sort of natural feel, I guess. And then that sort of fell away because I think inherently it was flawed. It relied too much on the dynamic type, that particular framework. It was quite nice in some ways and quite odd in others. When they came up with the .NET Core framework, they started off with MVC. But they didn't have a page-based framework. That came with Razor Pages about 2 years after, I think, the initial framework. And that sort of went back to this more natural way of development, as far as I was concerned, in a way. So that I just sort of, it felt like a natural home for me. So that's the framework I use in my sort of day-to-day job. And I don't know, I just sort of like to sort of evangelize it, I guess. I like people to be as enthused about the things that I'm enthusiastic about as I am.
Yeah, sure. Well, there's a lot to like there when you have requirements where using MVC or using Blazor or using any of the JavaScript frameworks just doesn't seem to fit. There's definitely its niche. Now, how would you classify the types of websites or web applications that are perfect for Razor pages and maybe has some difficulties, with other frameworks?
I mean, primarily it's a server-side framework. So it's if you want to generate your HTML on the web server, then Razor Pages is the sort of go-to framework as far as I'm concerned. Also, anything that you want to have sort of get SEO benefits from, it doesn't normally. The single-page frameworks don't tend to work well with SEO, whereas server-side ones do. So, I mean, if you wanted to put together a blog site, for example, or also line of business applications, I tend to use it for building a line of business applications where there's an awful lot of data, a lot of sort of forms over data.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the kinds of applications, I guess, where it really comes into its own.
Okay. Well, there's a lot that you've covered in the book. There's no way we can possibly cover it here on this podcast.
Oh, good.
But there's some overlap with some other frameworks. For example, doing the URL routing and the model binding. But for instance, one of your chapters is on model binding and tag helpers. How is that different or the same in Razor Pages? For those maybe who've looked at it, but really have mostly done ASP.NET MVC, or now they're jumping to Blazor and aren't giving Razor Pages a look. How is it different? How does it work in Razor Pages?
Okay, so just to back up a little bit, Razor Pages is a framework which is built on top of MVC.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the driving forces behind the introduction of the Razor Pages framework was to try to provide a simpler way to do all of the things that I was just talking about, the sort of forms over data, getting a server-side framework to generate HTML and send it to the client. And they didn't want to sort of start from scratch and build a completely new framework for that. There was no need to. So what they did was to reuse as much of the underlying MVC framework as possible. So things like model binding, where you're taking value or data from an HTTP request and binding it to data in your backend, is actually the underlying MVC model binding system. It isn't different. So when they want to add new features to model binding, both Razor Pages and MVC get the benefits of it. Routing is different. It works differently in Razor Pages to MVC. So they built a bunch of conventions which map pages in a Razor Pages application to the URLs are mapped to the files on disk, as opposed to MVC, where URLs are mapped to methods on a controller.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery. ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
So with a lot of commonalities then, are there any particular things that you lose if you do the application with Razor Pages and not MVC? If you're doing a server-side render, do you have to compensate for anything that maybe somebody was taking that they were taking for granted because they were using ASP.NET MVC with .NET 5 or 6 or 7?
No, far from it. Actually,
Okay.
you get stuff through. I mean, all of the things. So the MVC framework was originally introduced because of the difficulties in testing web forms. So they introduced a lot of extensibility points, and everything's interface based in MVC, so that you can sort of shim your implementations in and what have you, and that's all supported by a dependency injection system. Well, that dependency injection system is exactly the same for Razor pages. So you have all of that goodness is available to you. You don't lose anything. Let's taking one example. I do MVC applications, or I have got a big old MVC application, which I'm sort of in the process slowly of porting across to Razor pages. And that application was a long time ago. I realized that having sort of like a controllers folder and a views folder, and try to sort of work across the two folders to sort of locate stuff was a clunky way of working. And, there were plenty of blog posts about using feature folders, which is, you get that free with Razor pages because the URLs are file location based. So in order to work with a feature folder, all you have to do is to create a folder in your Razor pages application named after whatever the feature is. There's no sort of weird configuration that you have to do. Like you're not fighting with the framework. The framework supports that kind of approach. And it's a much more natural way of developing. So if you want to have a look at all your stuff for a customer, then you've got your folder called customer and you've got your stuff in there.
Okay. So with feature folders, do you like putting all of the code related to that feature in there, including data access code, or do you organize it differently?
Okay, so data access, I normally use Entity Framework Core and perhaps some Dapper in order to communicate with the database. And with EF Core, the database context is the primary means of talking to the database. Now, in Razor pages, the equivalent to the controller in an MVC app is a page model class. So each Razor page is comprised of a page model class and a Razor view page. And you could inject your DB context into the page model class and have it available to your. So it's equivalent to a code behind, I guess, for people who are more familiar with web forms. But the recommendation is that you don't do that because it makes your page model class less testable. You have to start doing test doubles for your DB context and things like that. My preference is to just abstract that away through a very thin service layer and use interfaces.
Okay.
But in a feature folder, my feature folders are normally got the individual pages for various parts of the sort of operations within the applications. You might have the standard ones, I guess you call index, create, delete, details, that sort of thing. Probably with a few partials as well. I tend to use partials quite a bit, which are sort of snippets, I guess. It's almost like components, I guess.
You mentioned testing. It's always a struggle to figure out how to test every bit of code, every bit of logic. And so with your Razor Pages apps, what do your test libraries and test cases look like, and how do you advocate organizing those?
To be honest, I don't do an awful lot of testing.
Okay. So automated tests, is it a compatibility thing with Razor Pages, or is it just your particular types of applications?
No, my particular types of applications don't tend to call for an awful lot of testing. I'll do some tests. Normally, I'll chase after things that went wrong with my tests. I'll do it completely the wrong way round. So that I look for things that can go wrong and then try to sort of cover those. But yeah, I do two types of tests myself. There's unit testing the service layers and the page model classes. And there's also, I'll use Playwright as well. I tend to do a lot of progressive enhancement on my pages. So it's not quite enough for a sort of single page application framework, but I'll maybe get an index page in one of the feature folders to display a sort of main form, and then there might be some more operations that I want to do on that. I mean, if I give it a quick example, say you take a customer form and you might have a bunch of tabs. So you might have tabs that look at their contacts, and a tab that's got orders, maybe a sort of like an editing history. for that particular record. And rather than fetch all the data for each of those tabs when the page first loads, I'll do that using some sort of Ajax and lazy load the content for the tabs when they're clicked on.
Okay.
And I'll use partial pages or partial files for the content of those tabs. So that I'll use fetch. It'll go and get the data, fill or partial, and the HTML comes back and it gets plugged into the relevant tab panel. And so I'll use Playwright to make sure that's working, because it's quite difficult to test that. So it's a sort of end-to-end test, I guess.
Yeah. Well, Playwright is a fairly new testing framework. What's been your experience? Do you love it? Is it a mixed bag?
I find it hard work, to be honest with you.
Okay.
The documentation isn't brilliant on it, and there seems to have been a change at some point in how, or the API that you use. So I'm sort of battling through it. It's relatively new. I'm relatively new to Playwright, but I'm going to persevere with it because I need to.
Right. Well, with so much logic and things that could just stop working when you're loading the page, especially these dynamic tabs. Yeah, you need to have some repeatable way to know that, okay, that still works.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So for the future, where do you see Razor pages going? There's Microsoft just keeps trucking along. What do you know is going to happen? People should watch out for, or maybe what do you hope happens?
It's a pretty mature framework, so I don't think there's a lot of scope for further development or sort of outstanding new features. It seems to me that the .NET Core team are sort of investing very heavily in a new model for Blazor, where you got a mixture of server side and client side rendering going on, which is all part of the .NET 8 framework effort.
Have you looked much into what is going to come out in the .NET 8 timeframe?
I have looked. I've looked at a little bit. I must confess. I noticed that there was an email I saw today that they got, I think, Preview 4. Is it that was announced as coming out today?
Yeah, I think so. What's the likelihood that the new Blazor model, the full stack Blazor, I think that they'll maybe end up calling it, that if you don't do any of the new Blazor stuff, but if you just lay down your HTML and CSS, that it may look a lot like a Razor Pages file?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I've done a bit of Blazor development, and it is a different development paradigm, because Razor Pages is very sort of HTML, CSS.
Yeah.
But Blazor's sort of much closer to React, I guess, in that it's very component oriented, and you're sort of plugging lots of bits and pieces in, and there's a lot of interaction between the components. But I guess if with the initial rendering, yes, it could look quite similar to a Razor page. It's just different tags on the page. But then, having said that, I guess it looks about as similar as, say, a web forms. It's probably, I think that Blazor thing is closer to web forms than Razor. I think Razor's closer to MVC.
Recently, just in the past year, there was a client with a active server pages application, built in the late 90s, and it seemed like the most straightforward path for modernizing that up to .NET 7 was to jump it straight into .NET 7 with Razor Pages, because classic ASP is all server side, and Razor Pages, that type of port didn't change the architectural concepts, and a port of the code was actually possible. Whereas it seemed like, and I want your opinion on it, it seemed like every other option was a total re-envisioning of the organization of the code from active server pages. How do you think of that modernization jump for people who do have old classic ASP applications? Is Razor Pages just a no-brainer destination?
I think so, yes. What I was saying a bit earlier is this: Blazor is a different development paradigm, being component-based. I remember sort of having a bit of a jolt when I moved from classic ASP, which was, as you say, it was VB script intermingled with HTML in the single file, and that has its own problems. Jolting from that to all of those tags that began with ASP : when I moved across to web forms. So yeah, I mean, I guess MVC was a lot more natural a progression if that'd been available at the time that I was migrating classic ASP things. So yeah, I think that Razor Pages is a more natural home. It's also a more natural home for migrating old framework MVC apps, which is what I'm doing. It works pretty well there because especially if they're Razor-based older MVC apps.
Yeah, and I imagine Cold Fusion as well, because Cold Fusion pretty much had the same shape as classic ASP.
Didn't it have tags? Weird tags, a bit more like web forms, didn't it?
Well, I remember it. It's been a long time.
Yeah,
but I remember it being, you had your page, and it was the file, and it was top-down execution.
Yes, that's right. The thing about Cold Fusion is it left huge amounts of white space. Is all I can really remember. That was the major characteristic of that particular framework. Yes, there was that, and there was Java beans as well, or Java servlets.
JSP pages. It was there was a Java very similar to ASP.
Yes, and PHP as well.
Yep. As we kind of get to the end of our time here, it amazes me that Microsoft has continued to provide a pool of options that can be used where, they're all interrelated. They have shared infrastructure under the covers, but they give you a different style, a different choice. And certainly today, like you mentioned, certain applications, blog sites are perfectly suited for Razor Pages, and a certain generation of 20-plus-year-old applications, those are a perfect porting destination for Razor Pages, whereas, other applications may be better ported into ASP and MVC or Blazor or, whatever comes along next.
I think that, the choice is the main thing. And it's always good to have choice. It's always good to have a look at different ways of doing things as well. And, component-based development has its good points, but it's a learning curve if you're sort of familiar with working with, basically web pages. But if you're coming across to .NET Core from React, then Blazor would be a natural home.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Well, we could talk for quite a bit longer about Razor Pages, but this has been a great episode and interview, and I appreciate, Mike, you coming on and talking to us about your new book, and we will include a link to the book in the show notes. Again, that's ASP.NET Core Razor Pages in Action. So thanks so much for being on the show, Mike.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Oh, my pleasure indeed. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.